Hi, I'm Daly. We recommend feeding cats high-protein, low-carbohydrate canned foods. The best way to know which foods fit these criteria is to look at the label. And there are two parts of the label to look at. The first part of the label to look at is the ingredient list. We recommend choosing foods with animal sources of protein and not plant proteins and not starches or sugars, not carbohydrates. This is usually fairly straightforward. Look for foods that are animals and vitamins and minerals. Stay away from ingredients such as wheat gluten, soy flour, rice, potatoes, carrots, etc. The second part of the label to look at is the protein content, but this can be a little confusing because protein is listed as a percentage of the weight of the food. Because dry food is lighter than canned food, you can't compare listed values directly. An average cat needs about 200 calories a day, so to illustrate how it is that canned food is higher in protein than dry food, let's look at two 70-calorie meals, one of canned food with 15% protein and one of dry food with 34% protein. The graphic on the left represents a small can of food. It is about 2.8 ounces, which weighs about 80 grams. Each cell in the graphic represents 1 gram of food. This 80 grams of canned food has about 70 calories, which is a reasonable meal for an average-sized cat. The graphic on the right represents about 70 calories of dry food. The first thing that you'll notice is that the dry food is a lot less food by weight than the canned. This is because canned food is mostly water. 70 calories worth of dry food weighs about 18 grams. So, here are the two meals, both about 70 calories. The canned food in this example is listed as having a maximum of 80% moisture, which is now represented with blue. Now, let me talk a little bit about the labeling. Food contains water, protein, fat, carbohydrates, and ash. The moisture, the water, is listed as a maximum value, and the protein and fat are labeled as minimum values. The rest of the food, which is to say the carbohydrates and the ash, a lot of times aren't listed. These may have to be estimated based on best calculations. The ash is mostly from the minerals in the food and is usually a relatively small percentage. Now, realize, since we don't have exact amounts of any of these nutrients, there's a fair amount of room for error, but it is still worthwhile to evaluate. The dry food in this example contains about 11% water. Remember, the blue in these graphics represents water. The part that isn't water, the part that isn't blue, is what is referred to as the dry matter. You can see that both of these meals contain about the same amount of dry matter. This makes sense given that they have about the same amount of calories. Now, let's look at the protein. We will use red to represent the protein. The canned food is labeled as having about 15% protein. That means that of that entire meal of canned food, 15% is protein. So the left graphic is 15% red. The dry food is labeled as having about 34% protein. So the right graphic is 34% red. Looking at these graphics, you will see that the percentage of the entire left graphic that is red is less than the percentage of the entire right graphic that is red. But if you ignore the water, if you ignore the blue cells, and just look at the percentage of the dry matter that is protein, there's a much higher percentage of dry matter that is protein on the left than on the right. This is what is meant by dry matter protein, and this is one way that foods are compared more fairly. In this example, you can see that 70 calories of the canned food contains about twice as much protein as 70 calories of the dry food. The green cells represent fat, the yellow is the carbohydrates, and gray is the ash. You can see that in this example, the dry food contains a lot more carbohydrates than the canned food. Now, when we talk about dry matter protein, it's usually not from the perspective of grams per 70-calorie meal. Rather, we talk about dry matter protein as a percentage. It is the percentage of the dry matter in the food that is protein. These are the equations to calculate dry matter protein. In the examples that we've been using, the canned food works out to have about 75% dry matter protein, and the dry food has about 38% dry matter protein. But not all canned food is high in dry matter protein, which is why it's important to look at that label. As an example, let's look at the label of Blue Buffalo's Basics Indoor Mature Turkey and Potato Entree. First, we'll look at the ingredients. According to the label, it contains turkey, which is a good animal protein, but it also contains pea protein, potatoes, carrots, flaxseed, cellulose, blueberries, cranberries, and pumpkin. The minimum protein is listed as 7%. The minimum fat is 4%, and the maximum moisture is 78%. We don't know what the actual amounts of any of these are, so all we can do is calculate as though each of these values is the true amount. This is what those calculations say. This blue buffalo has about 32% dry matter protein, which is less than a lot of dry foods. In an 80-gram meal of this particular variety of blue buffalo, the calculations say that there are about 5.6 grams of protein, 3.2 grams of fat, 7 to 8 grams of carbohydrates, and at least 80 calories. Thanks for watching.